November 1944, Camp Concordia, Kansas. The transport truck rattled to a stop outside a white farmhouse, and the German prisoners climbed down into the cold morning air, their breath forming clouds in the November chill. They expected another day of field work, the familiar rhythm of labor under watchful eyes. What they didn't expect was the farmer's wife standing on the porch, wiping flour from her hands, calling out in broken German, "After work, you stay. Sunday dinner." One prisoner, a former Panzer grenadier named Klaus Becker, later wrote in his diary that he felt his throat tighten. Not from hunger, from disbelief. Before we continue, if you're watching from anywhere in the world, Berlin, Boston, Bangalore, or Brisbane, drop a comment below and let us know. It's incredible that 70 years after these events, we're connected across continents, learning these stories together. If this kind of deep historical storytelling resonates with you, hit that like button and subscribe. It helps us keep bringing these forgotten moments back to life. Becker had been captured in France 3 months earlier. He'd marched through burning villages, slept in foxholes, and watched friends die in the hedgerows of Normandy. He expected retaliation. He expected cruelty. What he found instead, standing on that Kansas porch with the smell of roasting chicken drifting through the screen door, was something he had no framework to understand. Hospitality. From the enemy. And in that moment, staring at the farmer's smiling face, Klaus realized something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Everything he'd been told about America was a lie. The journey to that porch had begun months earlier, across an ocean thick with the wreckage of war. Over 400,000 German prisoners of war were transported to the United States between 1943 and 1945, the largest mass transfer of POWs in modern history. They came in the holds of Liberty ships, packed into converted troop transports, guarded by young American soldiers barely older than themselves. Most expected camps that mirrored the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front. They expected starvation, beatings, forced marches. The Geneva Convention was a distant abstraction, a document they'd been taught meant nothing when victory was at stake. But the United States had made a calculated decision. Follow the rules, not out of mercy alone, but strategy. Treat prisoners well, and they'd be cooperative. Treat them with dignity, and they'd return home with stories that might undermine the Nazi narrative. It was psychological warfare waged with roast beef and clean sheets. When the prisoners arrived at ports like Norfolk or New York, the first shock was the abundance. Docks stretched for miles, cranes swinging crates of supplies onto ships bound for Europe. Warehouses bulged with goods. Trains rolled past carrying tanks, trucks, artillery, an endless industrial river flowing toward the front. For men who'd left a Germany already choking under Allied bombing, already rationing bread and coal, the scale was incomprehensible. One prisoner later recalled watching stevedores unload crate after crate of oranges onto a pier. Oranges. Fruit he hadn't seen in 2 years. And these weren't for soldiers, they were routine cargo, destined for grocery stores in towns he'd never heard of. The trains carried them inland through landscapes untouched by war, no bomb craters, no skeletal buildings, just fields stretching to the horizon, small towns with churches and schools, children playing in yards. It was surreal. One prisoner, writing decades later, described pressing his face to the window as they passed through Illinois, watching a baseball game in progress. Men in uniforms, but not soldiers. Just civilians, laughing, throwing a ball. He'd forgotten such things existed. The camps themselves defied expectations. Rows of wooden barracks behind barbed wire, yes, but inside, conditions that shocked the Germans into silence. 3 meals a day. Real meat, vegetables, bread with butter. Milk, fresh and cold. In 1944, the daily ration for a German POW in an American camp was approximately 4,000 calories. For comparison, German civilians at the same time were surviving on fewer than 1,500. Prisoners gained weight. Their health improved. Some later admitted they'd never eaten so well, even before the war. Medical care was another revelation. Clean infirmaries staffed by trained doctors, dental work, vaccinations, treatment for injuries that had gone untended for months. In memoirs and interviews, former POWs repeatedly returned to this theme, the contrast between what they'd been taught to expect and what they actually experienced. Propaganda had painted Americans as barbaric, soft, decadent. But decadence, they discovered, meant medicine, education, and structure. The camps organized classes English, mathematics, trades. They allowed sports, theater, music. Orchestras formed. Soccer tournaments drew crowds of prisoners and guards alike. Libraries stocked German books, supplied by the Red Cross and YMCA, alongside American newspapers and magazines. For many prisoners, it was their first exposure to uncensored information. They read about D-Day from American perspectives. They saw photographs of liberated concentration camps, though many refused to believe them, dismissing the images as propaganda. Cognitive dissonance ran deep, but seeds of doubt were planted. Camp administrators understood that idle prisoners bred trouble, so they established workshops where men could learn carpentry, metalworking, leathercraft. Some camps even minted their own currency tokens prisoners could earn and spend at canteens stocked with tobacco, candy, toiletries. The system created a semblance of normalcy, a pocket economy within the barbed wire. Men who'd spent years following orders, marching, fighting, suddenly had choices again. Small ones, but choices nonetheless. What to buy, what class to attend, whether to join the camp choir or the chess club. Then came the labor programs. By 1944, American farms were hemorrhaging workers. Millions of men had been drafted, leaving entire communities unable to harvest crops or maintain livestock. In states like Nebraska, Kansas, Texas, and Minnesota, the shortage threatened to cripple food production. The solution was pragmatic. Put the prisoners to work, under guard, of course, but out in the fields where labor was desperately needed. The first convoys of German POWs arriving at rural farms provoked anxiety on both sides. American families saw men in uniforms, enemy soldiers who'd fought their sons in Europe. Prisoners saw hostile territory, uncertain what awaited them beyond the wire. But necessity forced proximity, and proximity bred familiarity. Farmers quickly realized these men knew their way around a field. Many had grown up in agricultural regions of Germany, Bavaria, Saxony, the Rhineland. They handled plows, tractors, livestock with practiced competence. They worked hard, and slowly the image of the faceless Nazi soldier began to dissolve into something more human. Young men who laughed at jokes, who whittled wooden toys during breaks, who hummed folk songs while stacking hay. Payment came in camp coupons, redeemable for small luxuries: chocolate, cigarettes, stationery. But farmers often slipped them extra: an apple, a sandwich, a thermos of coffee. These gestures, small as they were, carried weight. One prisoner in Nebraska later described being handed a slice of apple pie by a farmer's wife and feeling tears sting his eyes. Not because of the pie, because of what it represented. Kindness, from people who had every reason to hate him. Escapes were rare. Where would they go? America stretched for thousands of miles, and every face was a stranger's. Most prisoners settled into the rhythm. Morning roll call, a day's labor, return to camp. Routine, but bearable. And, increasingly, something more. Trust began to build. Farmers learned their names, asked about their families, shared stories, discovered that these Germans spoke of mothers, sisters, villages in ways that echoed their own lives. The war had drawn lines on maps, but out here in the fields, those lines began to blur. By autumn of 1944, something unexpected was happening across rural America. Guards reported that prisoners were returning from work details in better spirits, sometimes carrying small gifts from farmers: a worn pair of work gloves, a pocket knife, a hand-drawn map of the farm. These weren't contraband. They were tokens of respect. Farmers, for their part, began requesting specific prisoners by name. "Send me Klaus and Heinrich tomorrow," they'd tell the camp administrators. "They know how to fix the combine." Personal relationships were forming, built on shared labor and mutual reliance. The abstract enemy was becoming concrete individuals. Then came the invitations. At first, they were cautious: coffee on a porch, a sandwich at midday. But hospitality has its own momentum. Farmers' wives, watching these weary young men boys, really, some no older than 18, began to see sons. Brothers. And Sunday, in rural America, was sacred: church in the morning, family dinner in the afternoon. A ritual of rest and togetherness. In Iowa, Minnesota, Texas, Kansas, families began extending invitations. Not to all prisoners, only those who'd proven trustworthy, who'd worked hard, who'd shown respect. But the invitations came. The first time Klaus Becker stepped across the threshold of that Kansas farmhouse, he felt disoriented. The family had set the table with care: white cloth, real plates, silverware polished. The farmer, a man named Harold, gestured to a chair. Klaus hesitated. The guard stationed outside nodded. It was permitted. Klaus sat. Harold's wife, Martha, brought out platters: roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, fresh bread, a pitcher of milk, cold and frothy, and in the center, a pie. Apple, still warm. Klaus had been taught that Americans were weak, their society fractured, their people cowardly. But sitting at that table, surrounded by a family whose son was fighting in Europe, possibly against men Klaus had served alongside, he felt the propaganda crumble. Harold said grace, a simple prayer, thanking God for the food, for the safety of those present, for the hope of peace. Martha added quietly, "And bless those far from home." Klaus bowed his head and his eyes burned. This scene repeated across the country. In Texas, a prisoner named Heinz Miller carved a wooden horse for a farmer's daughter, who kept it for the rest of her life. In Minnesota, prisoners taught American children German folk songs, and in return learned, "You are my sunshine." In Nebraska, a farmer of German descent spoke to prisoners in the dialect of his grandparents, a language that sounded like home, and grown men wept. Music bridged gaps words couldn't. Harmonicas appeared after meals, and German melodies filled American living rooms. Families hummed along, not understanding the lyrics but feeling the longing they carried. Food became a language of its own. Prisoners shared recipes remembered from childhood: rye bread, sauerkraut, stews their mothers made. American families reciprocated with casseroles, pies, barbecue. Cultural exchange happened in kitchens, where the stakes were low and the gestures simple. But simplicity carried weight. One family in Kansas later recalled how a prisoner showed them a photograph of his mother, standing in front of a farmhouse that looked remarkably like their own. The symmetry was haunting. Different flags, same soil, not everyone approved. In some towns, whispers of disapproval circulated. Editorials warned against fraternization. Local officials reminded citizens that these were enemy soldiers, not guests. Letters appeared in newspapers questioning the wisdom of breaking bread with men who'd fought for Hitler. Some families whose sons had died overseas felt betrayed by such hospitality. The tensions were real, but enforcement was lax. The military recognized that cooperation depended on morale, and morale thrived when prisoners felt human. Guards rarely interfered with hospitality as long as security wasn't compromised, and security in these rural settings was rarely an issue. Where would a prisoner run? And why, when Sunday dinner was better than anything the barracks offered? Children were the great disarmers. Unencumbered by propaganda, they approached prisoners with curiosity rather than fear. They asked questions. "What's Germany like? Do you have a dog? Can you teach me that song?" Prisoners, many of whom had left younger siblings behind, responded with gentleness. They told fairy tales, Hansel and Gretel, Rumpelstiltskin that American children recognized from their own storybooks. Shared folklore became proof of shared humanity. The war had tried to erase that. Sunday dinners restored it. The rituals varied by region, but carried the same emotional weight. In the South, families served fried chicken, cornbread, sweet tea. In the Midwest, pot roast, mashed potatoes, apple pie. In Texas, barbecue brisket that prisoners had never tasted before, the smoke and spice overwhelming their senses. But everywhere, the pattern held. The setting of the table, the gathering of family, the moment of grace before eating. These rituals, mundane to Americans, felt sacred to prisoners who'd lived for years in chaos and violence. Structure, peace, the rhythm of normal life. Klaus Becker wrote in his diary about the moment he realized what these dinners meant. It was late 1944. Snow had begun to fall across Kansas. He sat at Harold's table surrounded by laughter and thought about his own family in Germany. His mother, if she was still alive, was likely huddling in a cold apartment, rationed to starvation levels, listening to air raid sirens. And here he was, warm, fed, safe. Guilt crashed over him, but so did something else, gratitude, and a creeping, undeniable realization. The regime that had sent him to war had lied about everything. America wasn't weak. It was overwhelming. And it had defeated Germany not with cruelty, but with abundance and decency. Other prisoners recorded similar epiphanies. One man from Munich wrote about watching Harold's daughter practice piano after dinner, her fingers stumbling over Mozart. Mozart. A German composer played in an American home while a German prisoner sat listening. The absurdity and beauty of it struck him silent. Another prisoner, a former Afrika Korps soldier, described helping Martha wash dishes after a meal, standing at her sink with soap on his hands, performing the most domestic of tasks while his country burned. These moments of normalcy felt more disorienting than combat ever had. The war ended in May 1945, but repatriation moved slowly. Camps remained open through 1946, some even into 1947. The longer prisoners stayed, the deeper the bonds grew. Some learned fluent English. Others took correspondence courses preparing for civilian life. Many exchanged addresses with the families who'd hosted them, promising to write. When the final orders came, "Pack your things," the ships are waiting. There were tears on both sides. Klaus Becker returned to Hamburg in early 1946. The city was unrecognizable. Entire neighborhoods flattened. Rubble mountains where apartment buildings had stood. His family home was gone. His mother had survived, living with relatives in the countryside. When Klaus found her, she was gaunt, aged beyond her years. He gave her the food parcels he'd been allowed to bring from America: canned goods, chocolate, coffee. She wept. Then he told her about Kansas, about Harold and Martha, about Sunday dinners. She listened, quiet, and when he finished, she said, "Thank God someone showed you kindness." Those stories spread. In the devastated landscape of post-war Germany, tales of American hospitality circulated among veterans. They told families, neighbors, anyone who'd listen. Some listeners dismissed the accounts as exaggeration, products of captivity syndrome. Others, desperate for hope, clung to them. The contrast between American treatment and Soviet brutality: prisoners in the East faced starvation, forced labor, death reinforced the narrative. Americans had been fair, more than fair. They'd been kind. In the 1950s and 60s, some former POWs returned to the United States, this time as tourists, immigrants, free men. They stood again on those porches, now grayer, older. They embraced the families who'd once hosted them. Harold and Martha were in their 70s when Klaus knocked on their door in 1961, unannounced, carrying a bottle of German wine and photographs of his own family. Martha wept. Harold gripped his hand and wouldn't let go. They sat at the same table where they'd shared that first meal 17 years earlier, and the conversation flowed as if no time had passed at all. Across America, these reunions multiplied. In Minnesota, a former prisoner brought his wife and daughters to meet the family who'd taught him English over Sunday roasts. In Texas, another traveled to a small cemetery where he placed flowers on the grave of the farmer who'd treated him like a son. Some former prisoners didn't just visit, they stayed. A handful immigrated permanently, settling in the very communities where they'd once been captives. They opened businesses, married American women, raised families who grew up hearing stories of the war from an unusual perspective. They visited graves of American soldiers, men who might have fought against them, and laid flowers. These pilgrimages became rituals. Former POWs would travel to military cemeteries, walk among the white crosses, and pay respects to the dead. The gesture carried profound symbolism. Former enemies honoring the fallen, acknowledging the cost of war while celebrating the peace that followed. Reconciliation, it turned out, had roots in those Sunday dinners. Historians later noted that the treatment of German POWs in America helped lay groundwork for post-war cooperation, for the Marshall Plan, for the transformation of Germany into a democratic ally. Academic studies in the 1970s examined how personal experiences shaped political attitudes. Surveys revealed that former POWs who'd been welcomed into American homes held significantly more favorable views of democracy. They became advocates for Western integration, voices of moderation in a divided Germany. The seeds planted across kitchen tables bore fruit in treaties and alliances. Klaus Becker never forgot. He raised his children on stories of Kansas, of Harold and Martha, of apple pie and grace before meals. He taught them that enemies were made by governments, but humanity was found across kitchen tables. His son later recalled how his father would describe the exact taste of Martha's chicken, the pattern on the tablecloth, the way Harold's hands looked folded in prayer. These weren't just memories. They were moral lessons about the capacity for goodness even in the darkest times. When Klaus died in 1987, his family found his diary, its pages filled with careful descriptions of Sunday dinners, of children's laughter, of the shocking generosity of strangers. The handwriting was precise, almost obsessive in detail, as if he feared forgetting a single moment. They donated it to a museum in Hamburg. It's there now, displayed behind glass, open to a page dated November 19, 1944. The entry describes his first Sunday dinner, ending with a single line. "Today I learned what grace means." The Sunday dinners were not strategy. They were not policy. They were individual acts of kindness, repeated across thousands of farms in hundreds of small towns. But their cumulative impact was profound. They proved that even in the machinery of global war, there was space for humanity, that enemies could become guests, that a tablecloth, a prayer, and a warm meal could accomplish what treaties could not. And for the men who sat at those tables young, defeated, far from home, the memory endured. Long after the camps closed, long after they'd returned to Germany and rebuilt their lives, they remembered and they wept, not from sorrow, from gratitude, and from the realization that kindness in the end was the most powerful weapon of all.